He was flying a plane made of fabric and steel tubing, barely faster than a car on a highway. The Germans below him commanded tanks that could destroy battalions. His weapon was strapped to the wings with metal brackets never designed to hold rockets. And on one morning in France, with fog covering the killing fields and 20 American soldiers trapped behind enemy lines, he made a choice that would rewrite the rules of war itself. September 20th, 1944. The fields outside Arracourt, France, were soaked with early autumn rain. Major Charles Carpenter stood beside his Piper L4 Grasshopper in the pre-dawn darkness, watching mechanics strap 6M9 bazooka tubes to the wing struts of an aircraft never meant to carry weapons at all. The plane shuddered with each gust of wind. Canvas fabric rippled across the fuselage. The entire machine weighed less than 1,200 pounds empty. With Carpenter inside, with fuel, with ammunition, with 6 rockets projecting from either side like the quills of some desperate insect, the little observation plane was grotesquely overweight and dangerously unbalanced. Carpenter was 43 years old. He had been a high school teacher before the war, history and woodshop. He had a wife named Elda and 2 sons back in Illinois who thought their father was somewhere safe, coordinating artillery from behind the front lines. That was what liaison pilots were supposed to do. Fly slowly over battlefields, spot enemy positions, radio coordinates back to the guns. Never engage, never attack. The L4 Grasshopper, affectionately called the Cub by everyone who flew it, had no armor, no self-sealing fuel tanks, no guns, no speed, no altitude capability. It was a civilian trainer with military paint. Carpenter had named his plane Rosie the Rocketer, stenciling the name carefully beneath the cockpit window. The mechanics stepped back. One of them, a corporal from Ohio, looked at Carpenter with something approaching pity. The rockets were live. The ignition wires ran through the cockpit. One spark, one short, one fragment of shrapnel striking the warheads, and Carpenter would vanish in a fireball before he could scream. The corporal said nothing. Carpenter nodded. He climbed into the cockpit. The seat was thin padding over a metal frame. The stick was between his knees. The instrument panel held an altimeter, an airspeed indicator, a compass, a fuel gauge, nothing else. No radio sophisticated enough to call for help. No parachute harness strong enough to matter at the altitudes he would be flying. He started the engine. The Continental 4-cylinder motor caught, settled into a rattling idle. 65 horsepower, the sound of a lawnmower. Carpenter advanced the throttle and the Cub lurched forward across the muddy grass strip, tail bouncing, wings flexing, rockets swaying. The plane felt wrong. Every pilot knows the feel of an aircraft in balance. This was not balanced. The nose wanted to drop. The wings wanted to fold. Carpenter held the stick with both hands and pulled back as the airspeed climbed past 30 miles per hour, past 40, past 50. The wheels left the ground. The Cub staggered into the air. Below him, the battlefield spread out in shades of gray and brown. Fog clung to the low ground, thick as smoke, hiding the roads and tree lines. Somewhere beneath that fog were elements of the 4th Armored Division, moving east toward the town of Arracourt. Somewhere in that same fog were German Panther tanks from the 5th Panzer Army moving west to stop them. Carpenter gained altitude slowly, painfully. The overloaded Cub climbed like a bird with broken wings. 100 feet, 200 feet. 300 feet. He leveled off. Any higher and he would lose visibility in the cloud layer. Any lower and he would be an easy target for every rifleman in France. The plan, if it could be called a plan, was simple. Carpenter would hunt for German armor. When he found a tank, he would dive at it, fire a rocket, and climb away before the tank crew could react. He had done this twice before, in smaller skirmishes, and both times he had survived more from German disbelief than from skill. No one expected an unarmed observation plane to attack a tank. It violated every doctrine, every expectation, every reasonable assumption about how wars were fought. The first time Carpenter had fired a bazooka from his Cub, the German tank crew had simply stopped and stared as the little plane wobbled overhead. The rocket had struck the rear deck and ignited the fuel stores. The second time, the crew had bilayed out before Carpenter even fired, certain that any aircraft attacking them must be carrying bombs or cannons far more lethal than the tiny shape suggested. But that was changing. Reports were coming in from all along the front. German troops were beginning to shoot at Cubs. Orders had gone out. The harmless little spotting planes were no longer harmless. Carpenter knew this. He knew that every sortie now carried a higher chance of death than the last. He also knew that American Sherman tanks were dying in catastrophic numbers against the German Panthers. The Sherman was outgunned, out-armored, slower to maneuver in the thick bocage country. A Panther could kill a Sherman from 1,000 yards. A Sherman had to close to 300 yards to penetrate a Panther's frontal armor, and by then the Sherman was usually burning. Carpenter flew east. The engine noise was a constant rattling drone. The wind screamed through the wing struts. The rockets vibrated. He scanned the ground below, searching for movement, for the dark rectangular shapes of tanks, for muzzle flashes, for anything that indicated where the fighting was concentrated. The fog thinned. He saw a road. He saw vehicles. He dropped lower. 4 tanks, Panthers, massive, angular, painted in camouflage greens and browns. They were moving in a staggered column along a dirt road that cut through a patch of forest. Carpenter's heart rate doubled. He could feel it in his chest, in his throat, in his hands on the stick. He banked left, circling, trying to position himself for an attack run. The tanks had not seen him yet. Their turrets were oriented forward. Their commanders were likely scanning for ground threats, not looking up. Carpenter pushed the stick forward. The Cub's nose dropped. Airspeed increased. 70 miles per hour, 80. The plane began to shake. The wings flexed visibly. The rockets swayed on their mounts. Carpenter aimed for the rearmost tank, the one farthest from the others, the one least likely to have support if things went wrong. He was dropping fast now, too fast, the ground rising up in a blur of green and brown. 200 feet, 100 feet, 50 feet. He could see the tank commander's head and shoulders protruding from the turret hatch. He could see the individual links of the track treads. He could see mud on the fender. He thumbed the ignition switch. The rocket leaped away from the wing with a burst of flame and smoke. The Cub yawed hard to the right, unbalanced by the sudden loss of weight on one side. Carpenter fought the stick, adding left rudder, pulling back, climbing. He did not see the impact. He was too busy trying to keep the plane from rolling over. The engine screamed. The wings groaned. He leveled off at 100 feet and looked back. The Panther was stopped. Smoke poured from the engine deck. The crew was bailing out, dropping from the hatches, running for the tree line. Carpenter felt no triumph. He felt only the sickening certainty that the other 3 tanks now knew he was here. He climbed higher, scanning. The lead Panther's turret was rotating, searching. The gunner would not waste a main gun round on a Cub, but the whole machine gun was already firing. Carpenter saw the tracers arcing up toward him, slow and lazy at first, then faster as they closed the distance. He banked hard right, diving toward the trees, using the terrain to break line of sight. The machine gun fire stopped. Carpenter climbed again. His hands were shaking. He had 5 rockets left. The Cub was lighter now, more responsive, but still dangerously unstable. He circled wide, coming around from the south, trying to put the sun behind him. The remaining Panthers had stopped. They were scanning the sky. Carpenter realized with cold clarity that he had lost the element of surprise. They were ready for him now. He attacked anyway. There was no other option. American troops were moving up that same road. If the Panthers were not stopped, they would slaughter the Shermans. Carpenter dove again, faster this time, steeper, aiming for the second tank in line. The Panther's machine gun opened up immediately. Tracers filled the air. Carpenter heard impacts, fabric tearing, metal pinging. Something hot grazed his left arm. He ignored it. He was committed now. Pulling out meant exposing his belly to fire. He fired a rocket, missed. The warhead struck the road beside the tank and exploded in a shower of dirt. Carpenter pulled up hard, so hard the wings bent, so hard his vision grayed at the edges. The Cub clawed for altitude. More machine gun fire, this time from multiple tanks. The air was full of tracers. Carpenter jinked left, right, climbing, diving, doing everything he could to be unpredictable. A round punched through the fuselage 6 inches behind his seat. Another shattered the instrument panel. The altimeter exploded in a spray of glass. Carpenter kept flying, muscle memory, instinct. He had no instruments now. He had only the feel of the plane, the sound of the engine, the visual reference of the horizon. Came around again. This was insane. He knew it was insane. But he also knew that 2 Panthers were still operational and 2 Panthers could kill dozens of men. He dove a third time. The tanks were moving now, trying to disperse, trying to make themselves harder targets. Carpenter picked the nearest one. He dropped to 30 feet above the ground, so low he could see the faces of the crew, so low he could see the panic in their eyes. He fired. The rocket streaked forward and struck the Panther's turret ring. The explosion was small, almost pathetic, but the turret stopped moving. The tank slewed to a halt, immobilized. The crew began evacuating. Carpenter did not wait to see more. He pulled up and turned west, running for friendly lines. The engine was coughing. Something was wrong. Oil pressure dropping, temperature rising. He had been hit. He did not know where. The Cub shuddered and bucked. He nursed the throttle, trying to keep the engine alive long enough to reach the American positions. The fog was thickening again. He dropped lower, following a creek bed, using the terrain to hide himself. He made it back, barely. The engine seized just as he crossed the front line. Carpenter put the Cub down in a pasture, hard, the wheels digging into soft earth, the plane nosing over and coming to rest with the tail in the air. He climbed out. His hands were still shaking. His left arm was bleeding where the shrapnel had grazed him. A medic ran over. Carpenter waved him off. He walked back to the airstrip. Mechanics were already bringing up another Cub. They would mount the rockets again. They would refuel, and Carpenter would go back up. He flew 2 more sorties that day. The second sortie was reconnaissance. The fog had thickened to the point where attacking was impossible. Carpenter flew low and slow, mapping German positions, radioing coordinates back to artillery units. He saw the destruction from his earlier attack. 3 Panthers abandoned or destroyed. He saw German infantry digging in along a ridgeline. He saw supply trucks moving up. He called in artillery. The guns responded within minutes. The trucks disappeared in eruptions of smoke and dirt. The third sortie came late in the afternoon. The fog had lifted slightly. Visibility was better, and Carpenter received a radio call that changed everything. 20 American soldiers were trapped at a Waterpoint 2 miles behind German lines. They had been cut off during the morning fighting, surrounded, pinned down by machine gun and mortar fire. They were out of ammunition. They were out of options, and they were going to die unless someone did something. Carpenter took off with 4 rockets mounted. The Cub was lighter this time, more agile, but Carpenter felt heavier. He was exhausted. His arm throbbed. His eyes burned from strain and smoke. He had not eaten since dawn. He had not slept in 30 hours. But 20 men were going to die. That was all that mattered. He flew east, following the landmarks he had memorized from earlier flights. A burned-out farmhouse, a destroyed bridge, a stand of poplars bent by shelling. The Waterpoint was in a small depression surrounded by low hills. Carpenter saw the American soldiers immediately. They were clustered behind a stone wall, hunched down, trying to make themselves small. Surrounding them were German positions, machine gun nests, mortar pits, infantry in trenches. The Americans were completely encircled. Carpenter had 4 rockets. He had one chance. If he failed, the Germans would kill the trapped soldiers out of spite. If he succeeded, the soldiers might have time to escape before reinforcements arrived. He climbed to 500 feet, higher than he liked, but he needed to see the entire battlefield. He planned his attack run. He would come in from the north, hit the machine gun nest covering the main escape route, then circle and hit the mortar pit. The other 2 rockets he would save for targets of opportunity. He dove. The Cub screamed downward, engine roaring, wind howling. The German machine gunners saw him coming. They traversed their weapon firing. Tracers reached up. Carpenter ignored them. He was focused entirely on the target. 200 feet, 100 feet, 50 feet, he fired. The rocket struck the sandbag wall of the machine gun nest and exploded. The gun went silent. Carpenter pulled up, banking hard right, gaining altitude. The trapped Americans were already moving, running for the gap he had created. Carpenter came around again. The mortar pit was harder to see, dug into the hillside, camouflaged. He dove anyway, trusting his memory, trusting his instinct. He fired at what he thought was the position. The rocket hit 20 yards short and exploded harmlessly. Carpenter cursed. He had 2 rockets left. The Americans were halfway to safety, but German infantry were closing in from the flanks. Carpenter dove again, this time targeting the infantry. He fired. The rocket struck the ground in the middle of a German squad and detonated. Men scattered. Bodies fell. Carpenter did not look. He was already lining up his final shot. The mortar pit fired. Carpenter saw the flash, saw the round arcing upward. He knew instantly that it was aimed at the escaping Americans. He had seconds. He pushed the stick forward, diving almost vertically, the Cub shaking apart, the wings groaning, the engine screaming in protest. He fired his last rocket not at the mortar pit but at the ground in front of it, trying to suppress the crew, trying to make them flinch, trying to buy the Americans 5 more seconds. The rocket struck. The mortar pit went silent. Carpenter pulled out of the dive so close to the ground that the wheels brushed the grass. He climbed, turning, searching for the Americans. They were clear. All 20 of them running west, running for friendly lines, running for life. Carpenter felt something break inside him, not physically, emotionally. He had done it. They were going to live. And then the engine quit. No coughing, no sputtering, just silence. The propeller windmilled uselessly in the slipstream. Carpenter was at 300 feet with no power and no altitude to trade for distance. Below him was German-held territory. He scanned desperately for a place to land. There, a field, small, rough, but clear of obstacles. He banked toward it, bleeding airspeed, setting up a glide. The Cub descended in eerie quiet. Only the wind and the whisper of fabric and the pounding of Carpenter's heart. He flared too high. The plane stalled. The left wing dropped. The Cub hit the ground hard, the landing gear collapsing, the wing crumpling, the fuselage skidding sideways through the grass. Carpenter was thrown forward against the instrument panel. His head struck something. Everything went white, then black, then white again. He woke to silence. His head throbbed. Blood ran down his face. He was still in the cockpit. The Cub was on its side, the fuselage twisted, the engine half buried in dirt. Carpenter unbuckled and crawled out through the shattered windscreen. He stood. His legs nearly gave out. He looked around. German voices, close, very close. He started running. He ran west. He had no weapon, no map, no compass. He ran through fields and over fences and across ditches. He ran until his lungs burned and his legs cramped and his vision blurred. He ran until he saw American helmets, American uniforms, American faces. They pulled him into a foxhole. A lieutenant asked who he was. Carpenter could barely speak. He gasped out his name, his unit. The lieutenant stared at him. "You're Bazooka Charlie," the lieutenant said. Carpenter nodded. "You just saved 20 of my men." Carpenter said nothing. He sat down in the foxhole and put his head in his hands and shook. The Battle of Arracourt continued for another 2 weeks. It was one of the largest tank battles fought on the Western Front, and one of the most one-sided. The 4th Armored Division destroyed or disabled over 200 German tanks while losing fewer than 30 of their own. Historians would later attribute the American victory to superior tactics, better intelligence, and effective use of combined arms. They rarely mentioned Charles Carpenter, but the tankers mentioned him. The infantrymen mentioned him. The men who had been trapped at the Waterpoint mentioned him. Carpenter flew again, not the next day. His Cub was destroyed and he was too battered to climb into a cockpit. But within a week he was back in the air, a new plane, new rockets, same insane mission. He flew through October. He flew through November. He flew until the weather turned too cold and the fog too thick and the German defenses too prepared. By then the Luftwaffe had issued specific orders regarding Cubs. Shoot them down. Always. They were no longer considered reconnaissance aircraft. They were considered threats. German tank commanders began carrying machine pistols and rifles specifically to fire at low-flying Cubs. German infantry were trained to lead their targets, to aim ahead of the slow-moving planes, to anticipate their flight paths. Carpenter lost friends. Other liaison pilots who had adopted his tactics, who had mounted bazookas on their own Cubs, who had decided that the risk was worth the reward. Some were shot down. Some crashed. Some simply disappeared, lost in the fog and chaos and endless violence of the front. Carpenter himself was never hit again. Luck perhaps, skill perhaps, or perhaps the same quality that had allowed him to be a schoolteacher before the war, the ability to read a situation, to understand what students needed, what soldiers needed, what a battlefield needed at any given moment. He flew until December when illness finally grounded him. Pneumonia, complicated by exhaustion and stress and too many nights sleeping in frozen tents. He was evacuated to a field hospital, then to England, then home to the United States. He never flew combat again. The war in Europe ended in May of 1945. Carpenter was still recovering. He listened to the news on the radio. Victory in Europe Day. Celebrations in the streets. He felt nothing, or perhaps he felt too much. He thought about the men he had saved. He thought about the men he had killed. He thought about the Germans in the tanks, the ones who had burned, the ones who had run. He thought about how thin the line was between heroism and murder, between duty and insanity. After the war, Carpenter returned to teaching. He taught history and woodshop in the same Illinois high school where he had worked before enlistment. He rarely spoke about the war. When students asked, he deflected. When reporters asked, he declined. He gave one interview, years later, to a military historian. In that interview, Carpenter was asked if he had been afraid. He paused for a long time before answering. "Every second," he said, "every single second I was in the air, I was terrified. I was certain I was going to die, but I was more afraid of what would happen if I didn't fly. The men on the ground needed someone to do something impossible, so I did it." The historian asked if Carpenter thought his actions had mattered. If 20 men saved, if 4 tanks destroyed, if a few battles influenced, if any of it had made a difference in a war that involved millions. Carpenter thought about that too. "I don't know if it mattered to the war," he said, "but it mattered to those 20 men. It mattered to their families. It mattered to the soldiers who didn't get killed by those tanks. So yes, it mattered." Charles Carpenter died in 1966. He was 65 years old. He died of heart failure, alone in his home, sitting in his favorite chair. His wife found him. The newspaper obituary mentioned his teaching career and his military service. It did not mention Rosie the Rocketer. It did not mention Arracourt. It did not mention the Waterpoint. The men who had been there, the men who had been saved, they learned about his death through phone calls and letters. Some of them traveled to Illinois for the funeral. They stood in the rain, and they saluted a man who had flown a fabric plane armed with rockets into the teeth of German armor, because no one else could. The Piper L-4 Grasshopper was never designed to be a weapon. It was designed to be slow, stable, and safe. It was designed to observe, not to engage. Every military doctrine, every tactical manual, every reasonable assessment of the aircraft's capabilities suggested that using it as an attack platform was suicide. Charles Carpenter proved them all wrong, not because he was reckless, but because he understood something fundamental about war. Doctrine is written in peacetime by people who have never been shot at. Tactics are refined by people who have time to think. But battles are won by people who see what needs to be done and do it, regardless of whether it makes sense on paper. The German military, renowned for its tactical flexibility and doctrinal innovation, changed its entire approach to small aircraft because of Carpenter. Orders went out across the front. Cubs were to be engaged on sight. They were to be treated as combat aircraft, not reconnaissance platforms. Resources were diverted. Training was updated. All because one middle-aged schoolteacher from Illinois decided that the rules did not apply when men were dying. There is a tendency in modern times to view the Second World War through a lens of inevitability. The Allies won because they had more resources, more industry, more manpower. The outcome was determined by economics and geography and production capacity. Individual actions, individual heroism, individual moments of desperate courage, these are treated as footnotes, as interesting anecdotes that did not change the ultimate trajectory of history. But that view is wrong. Wars are not fought by nations. They are fought by human beings, individual human beings, each of whom makes choices every single day about whether to act or to hide, to risk or to survive, to do what is safe or to do what is necessary. Charles Carpenter chose necessity. He chose it knowing that he would probably die. He chose it knowing that no one would remember. He chose it because 20 men needed someone to do something impossible, and he was the only one there who could try. That choice did not win the war, but it saved lives. It changed doctrine. It proved that individual action still matters, even in conflicts so vast that individual human beings seem irrelevant. The men at the Waterpoint went home. They had children. Those children had children. There are people alive today walking around, living ordinary lives who exist only because Charles Carpenter flew a plane made of fabric into a battlefield made of steel. They do not know his name. They do not know what he did, but they are here. That is the legacy. Not medals, not monuments, not history books. Life. Continuation. The simple, profound fact that some people exist because one person refused to accept that nothing could be done. The L-4 Grasshopper was retired after the war, replaced by helicopters, by jets, by aircraft that could actually survive combat. But for a brief moment in France in the autumn of 1944, the slowest, weakest, most vulnerable aircraft in the American arsenal became something else entirely. It became hope. It became defiance. It became proof that courage is not about the absence of fear, but about the choice to act despite it. Charles Carpenter was afraid every second he flew. He said so himself, but he flew anyway. And that, more than any medal or commendation or historical footnote, is what matters. The choice to act, the willingness to try, the understanding that doing nothing is also a choice, and often the worst one. If you found this story meaningful, if it made you think about courage differently, about war differently, about what individuals can do in impossible situations, then share it. Subscribe to this channel so you can hear more stories like this. Stories about ordinary people who did extraordinary things not because they were special, but because the moment demanded it and they were there. Leave a comment. Tell me what you think. Would you have made the same choice? Could you have flown into fire knowing you would probably die? Do individual acts of courage still matter in modern warfare? Or have our wars become too large, too technological, too impersonal for one person to make a difference? I think they still matter. I think they will always matter. Because wars are not fought by machines. They are fought by human beings. And as long as human beings are involved, individual choices, individual acts of courage, individual moments of desperate heroism will continue to change everything. Charles Carpenter proved that. 20 men and their families proved that. History proved that. Remember his name. Remember what he did. And remember that you, too, might someday face a moment when the safe choice and the right choice are not the same thing. What you do in that moment will define you. Choose wisely.